Whereas European countries expanded by creating overseas colonies, the United States expanded over the North American continent, which allowed Americans to claim that their country was democratic rather than imperialistic. But in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the end of the frontier. This created a crisis of American exceptionalism. The idea that a frontier made America exceptional was popular in the U.S. and Europe. In the early 1820s, German philosopher George Hegel remarked that only after the immeasurable space which that country presents to its inhabitants shall have been occupied will America be comparable to Europe. Historian Frederick Turner wrote that, so long as free land exists, the opportunity for competency exists, and economic power secures political power. In other words, as long as there's free land, there are opportunities for social and economic mobility. Concurrent with the closing of the frontier, the 1890s was a decade of burgeoning unrest. As factories filled up with unsold goods due to the 1890s depression, unemployed workers initiated violent strikes. Even though labor unrest wasn't new, it still was interpreted as a consequence of the end of the frontier and the beginnings of a class conflict-ridden society. With the end of the frontier, expansion would have to go overseas. As the United States Senator put it, "From the Atlantic to the Pacific, we have dotted all our land with villages and towns and cities. Our activity at home is unparalleled, but something else is needed. The opportunity for the adventurous spirit of our citizens to have free course is being limited as we are settling up our lands, and it is to the ocean that our children must look, as they have looked to the boundless West, for the opportunity to develop their ambition and their talents." United States Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan perhaps articulated the imperialist imperative of the closed frontier best. As he wrote for Harper's Magazine, more and more civilized man is needing and seeking ground to occupy, room over which to expand and in which to live. He combined the notion of imperialist expansion with racial, social Darwinist justification. Strong races eventually dominated over weaker races. That is, he argued, what happened in the United States with the Native Americans. To continue expansion, the U.S. would need overseas markets. But overseas markets would need to be protected by naval bases, which would then need to be secured by colonies. In the 1890s, the United States began building up its navy, and by 1898 it would have the fifth largest navy in the world. This military buildup would find its use in the Cuban War for Independence. In 1895, colonized Cubans revolted against the Spanish Empire. Their method of resistance entailed a style of hit-and-run surprise attacking called guerrilla warfare, which relies on support from local populations. So the Spanish built fortified areas and commanded all Cuban civilians to move into those areas. Anyone who failed to do so within a certain time frame was deemed an enemy combatant and killed. These concentration camps were overcrowded and suffered poor sanitary conditions, resulting in thousands of deaths from disease and malnutrition. The Cuban Revolution coincided with the emergence of the yellow press in the United States. As newspapers such as William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World competed for national audiences, they turned to sensationalism. This might mean catchy headlines, exaggerated claims, or dramatic assertions. On an almost daily basis, they depicted atrocities in Cuba, some real, some maybe made up. They also played up other things. For instance, here's a depiction of an American woman being strip-searched by what looks like some unsavory Spaniards. This helps drum up public and congressional support for war. There were a number of different reasons people wanted a war with Spain. Some of the American public felt affinity with the Cuban struggle for independence, since the United States had also fought a war of independence against a European empire. Many businessmen supported this war as a way to open up new markets and sources of raw materials. After the Spanish-American War, American investors would pour into Cuba and buy up plantations, factories, railroads, and refineries. There were also sentiments relating to the closing of the frontier. A war with Spain would allow the United States to acquire colonies. A war was also an opportunity for American men to express or maintain their martial and manly vigor. Theodore Roosevelt embraced this perspective. He believed that out of the potpourri of European ethnicities, an American race had been forged through wars with Indians. With Native Americans in the wilderness subdued, American men needed new avenues to test their mettle and steel their souls. What he believed applied to the individual also applied to the nation as a whole. As he wrote in one of his famous speeches, National Duties, "Man must be glad to do a man's work, to dare and endure and to labor, to keep himself and to keep those dependent upon him. As it is with the individual, so it is with the nation." What this means is just as men are supposed to take care of their dependents, i.e. women and children, so should stronger nations control weaker ones. Even with widespread support, President McKinley was reluctant, but the sinking of an American battleship, the Maine, on February 15, 1898 forced his hand. Later investigations indicate that the Maine sunk because of an accidental explosion in one of its engine rooms, but the Yellow Press reported it as a brazen attack from the cowardly Spanish. The war lasted 144 days, resulting in 460 American combat deaths. 5,200 died of disease. Secretary of State John Hay referred to this as a splendid little war. On August 12th, an armistice was declared, In what is called the Treaty of Paris, Spain agreed to cede Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. Just as Cuba began fighting for its independence in the mid-1890s, so did the Philippines, led by Filipino General Emilio Aguinaldo. He believed that the war between the United States and Spain would result in the Philippines becoming a protector to the United States. On June 12, 1898, he proclaimed Philippine independence and established Asia's first republic, but it would not be an independent republic for long. Again, President McKinley was reluctant to take over the Philippines, but a lot of people in the Americas were not so reluctant. An empire in the Pacific could give the United States access to Asian markets, particularly China. As one business promoter wrote, "In China there are 400 million of people. More than 5 times as many exist in the United States. The wants of these 400 million are increasing every year. What a market!" As Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge very bluntly put it, "We make no hypocritical pretense of being interested in the Philippines solely on account of others. While we regard the welfare of these people as a sacred trust, we regard the welfare of the American people first. We see our duty to ourselves as well as to others. We believe in trade expansion." Then, more directly related to the issue of race, an American government official would state that questions of conscience need not trouble us. Here are rich lands, held by those who do not or cannot get the best out of them, and awaiting the fructifying application of capital and organization and commerce. Under this beneficent view, the natives, an inferior race, must get out or become laborers. The Filipino is an encumbrance to be got rid of, unless he accepts the mandates of a purchasing and a conquering power. This was the same reasoning applied to Native Americans. Only those who use the land most profitably have a right to it. Since the Filipinos were not using the land in ways that Americans deemed profitable, they had no right to the land and could be enslaved or exterminated. President McKinley eventually had a change of heart, claiming that God told him in a dream to take the Philippines in order to protect and Christianize them. In 1899, the United States invaded the Philippines. This was aided by the Yellow Press, which simultaneously depicted Filipinos as children and savages. As children, it meant they could not be dealt with reasonably. One senator put it this way: "We must never forget that in dealing with the Filipinos, we deal with children. Depicting them as savages justified treating them savagely." One general stated that it may be necessary to kill half of the Filipinos in order that the remaining half of the population may be advanced to a higher place of life than their present semi-barbarous state affords. The U.S. military set up the same kinds of concentration camps that the Spanish built in Cuba. Similar to the use of waterboarding during the Iraq War, the U.S. military used what they called the water cure in the Philippines. In one of the most extreme acts of the war, General Jacob Smith ordered his men to turn an island into a howling wilderness by killing everyone over the age of 10. In key ways, this war built off of American traditions. The language used to refer to Filipinos by the press, by politicians, and by the soldiers themselves in letters was the same language used to describe Native Americans and African Americans. And the tactics used against Filipino freedom fighters was the same kind of tactics used against Native Americans. In 1 week in 1901, for example, U.S. soldiers destroyed 1 million tons of rice and 6,000 homes. This harkened back to the U.S. military's annihilation of the buffalo in order to starve the Comanche. Wars against Native Americans, and then against Filipinos, prefigure total war. In total war, you don't just target enemy combatants, but the entire economy which produces the enemy combatants. In terms of the Philippines, this entailed destroying the food supply of the Filipino people, which had devastating effects. Of the 200 to 700,000 Filipinos who died in the war, only about 20,000 were actual combatants. In March of 1901, Emilio Aguinaldo was captured. Intermittent guerrilla fighting would occur all the way up to 1913, but effectively the war was over by 1902. The Philippines technically is the only official colony in United States history. In the invasion of the Philippines, we see parallels with the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, as well as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan early in the 21st century. In each of these cases, the United States claimed to be a reluctant participant, invading for the purpose of freeing populations from some greater threat. In the Philippine War, the United States claimed to be there to free them from savagery and other exploitative imperial powers. In Vietnam, the purported goal was to free the Vietnamese people from communism. In Afghanistan and Iraq, though initially about fighting terrorism, eventually came to be justified on the grounds that the United States was bringing democracy. In all these instances, you have a large army occupying a country for many years and brutal prosecution of the war. Several 100,000 people died in the invasions of the Philippines, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In Vietnam, civilian deaths numbered in the millions. In all these wars, there were very powerful undertones of racial or cultural superiority that justified much of the brutality. In each case, except perhaps Afghanistan, invasion was based on lies. It's kind of formal liberation empire, while important, would not be as constant as the more informal empire that more often characterized the foreign policy of the United States in the 20th century. When the U.S. declared war on Spain in 1898, Congress passed the Plat Amendment, which stated that the U.S. had no intention of colonizing Cuba. In 1902, the U.S. removed troops from Cuba and gave them their independence. For this to happen, the Cubans had to agree to include in their constitution the Plat Amendment. The Plat Amendment barred Cuba from making treaties with other nations. It gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba under the pretext of preserving independence, life, and property, and it required Cuba to permit American naval stations on its territory. This is why in Guantanamo Bay there is a detention camp. The right to make treaties and territorial sovereignty are essential characteristics of an independent nation and were denied to Cuba by the Plat Amendment. Since investors had bought up land, plantations, refineries, and infrastructure in Cuba after the war, the United States would intervene repeatedly to repress anti-imperialist revolts. American troops occupied Cuba from 1906 to 1909, and in 1912 they put down a revolt by black plantation workers. Both the informal empire and formal empire relate to the notion of American exceptionalism. For the formal empire, the U.S. could say that they are not there to exploit like European powers, but to promote freedom. For the informal empire, the U.S. could control the affairs of other nations while claiming that it isn't an empire because it isn't occupying the lands. It would be easy to think that the social Darwinist imperialism of a century ago has passed. Still, it operates insidiously. The 500,000 Iraqis killed by a war based on lies hardly registers in our consciousness, but the 5,000 American troops who died fighting the war must never be forgotten. The destruction of the Twin Towers was an abomination that justified preemptive wars, but the demolition of entire cities elsewhere, including 36,000 houses, 9,000 shops, 65 mosques, and 60 schools in the bombing of Fallujah alone, is just collateral damage. Palestinians living in an open-air prison losing their homes and lands while watching their children slowly die must bear it peacefully, lest they be labeled terrorists. All the while, Israeli snipers target unarmed civilians during protests, and the U.S. continuously bombs and drone strikes more than half a dozen countries with little regard for civilian life and property. We readily believe narratives about meddlesome authoritarian dictators from a media and intelligence community that has continually lied to us, even as our government militarily supports 3/4 of the world's dictators, openly orchestrates coups, starves civilian populations with sanctions, and runs torture camps filled with mostly innocent people. It's not that there aren't oppressive governments around the world. 125 years ago, the Spanish were oppressing the Cubans and the Filipinos. But the Cubans and Filipinos were more than capable of liberating themselves from the Spanish, just as over half a dozen Latin American republics had done so throughout the 19th century. U.S. intervention just co-opted independence movements to turn colonies into neo-colonies for the sake of capitalist exploitation. It's also not that people are aware of all the terrible things U.S. empire does and openly cheers for them. It is that they uncritically accept the necessity of U.S. empire, which implies that people in the global south are barbarians for whom despotism is a legitimate mode of government. Every sin of empire is quickly forgotten or rationalized as unfortunate and anomalous excess. Every act of resistance from the other is unforgivable and justification for further domination. Just as a century ago, imperial processes are both internal and external. We don't ask what social conditions causes spikes in homelessness, mass poverty, and crime. Instead, we criminalize poverty and demand more prisons and more aggressive policing. How can we justify the mass repression at home and mass destruction wrought abroad, except if we believe consciously or subconsciously that certain groups of people, be it because of their cultures, choices, or even race, are inferior, are less decent and less worthy of life and dignity as ourselves? We do this in the name of liberty and democracy. In this way, we are no different from the general who claimed we may have to kill half the Filipinos in order to uplift the other half. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.